Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. We're just going to take a couple of minutes to give everyone time to dial in, and then we'll get started with our conversation this morning.
How often do you get a chance to be quiet?
No. Quiet and waiting.
Statue still, as my little voice tells.
Good morning, everybody that's joining in. We can see you all coming in, so we're just going to take a couple of minutes to let everybody join, because it is a bit of an earlier than usual start, possibly for some. So we'll give everybody a little bit more time, but we will kick off quite soon. Right, I think what we'll do is kick off, because we're going to have some introductions and things first, and hopefully anybody that's sort of joining in will catch up pretty quickly to the conversation this morning. But welcome everybody, it's great to have you joining us. As you know, we run a fairly regular series of events, really aiming to bring financial communicators and marketers together around the key issues that we're all tackling and that are impacting us every day. And this morning, given where we're at in the year, we're turning our attention to 2021 and what the times have changed and everything that brands and consumers have experienced this year will mean for next year. What will audiences be thinking, feeling and doing? And how does this mean that we need to approach our planning and also slightly reframe our thoughts and expectations for 2021? Those 3-year plans for businesses that might have been written 2 years ago, what do they look like now? How have things evolved and changed? Before we get going, I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. Each of them brings a unique perspective on audiences, so together hopefully give you a really good picture of what's happening for the people you're trying to target. So I will ask you all to introduce yourselves now. Adrian, would you mind going first for us this morning?
Yeah, of course. Good morning. So my name's Adrian Walcott and I'm the Managing Director of Brands with Values. We are leaders in decoding culture and business transformation for the FTSE 250. Prior, I was in the marketing world for many years, starting at Ogilvy, and then spent a long time at Barclays before latterly running the brand across Europe for Eurostar.
Great, thank you. William?
Yes, William Higham. I'm a behavioural futurist. I run a strategic consultancy called The Next Big Thing, and we've worked with everybody from Amazon to Walt Disney to HSBC. And our job is to help our clients better understand what their customers' needs are going to be in the future. What will they want? What will they expect from their clients? And how, most importantly, how can you appeal to them better in the future?
Great, thank you. And Paul?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Paul Flatters. I'm the co-founder and chief executive of Trajectory, which is a consumer trends analysis and forecasting business. We help our clients plan future strategies and also innovate. Prior to setting up Trajectory, I'd worked at various other forecasting places like the Henley Centre for Forecasting and the Future Foundation, and also had a time as head of analysis and research for BBC News and the research director at Which.
Great, thank you. And finally, Simon.
Morning, everyone. I'm Simon Moore. I'm the chief exec of Innovationbubble, and we're a group of psychologists. Not quite sure what you call a group of psychologists, probably a paranoia for some people. But we kind of deal with things like marketing, onboarding, comms in terms of the customer world. And then for employees, which I think is going to be just as interesting this morning, we will deal with things like engagement and well-being. But it's all about the whys and the hidden reasons why people do engage and don't engage with you as a brand.
Great, thank you everybody. And just before we get started, a little bit of a tech note is to say that the chat functionality within Zoom does work, and we can see any comments or questions that you put into the chat function. So do please feel free to do that as we go, and we'll also leave a bit of time at the end for questions. Excuse me, I was about to sneeze. Okay, so what I'd like us to kick off with this morning is to really have a think about the topic for the session and what we were setting up to talk about. And really, it is a very big topic. And what I would invite our panelists to do now is to really just kick us off with some of your initial thinking and thoughts on the topic. And for me, the big piece is around change and also how this change has impacted audiences. I think 2020 will always sort of go down as a pretty big year. And so what are your thoughts on the impact of this for audiences? Adrian, would you mind kicking us off again?
Yeah, sure. I think what we've seen, we've just done a piece of research on sort of which values matter most post-COVID-19. And we did this with a management today, and we consulted sort of leaders across the public, private sectors. And admittedly, we focused on employees, but of course, employees, consumers, there's obviously a natural connection there, which we'll come on to explore later on. But some of the things that were coming through quite strongly were things around people wanted to be part of organizations that were more socially responsible and thinking about what they do in that space. There was lots of values coming through around people wanting to be in organizations where there's lots of community, caring for others, and also lots of notions around honesty and transparency, which is quite interesting when you think about the connection between employees and service-based businesses. So I think it's really important to think about those kinds of themes, but obviously in the connection with that and the audiences that they serve. So that's some of the underlying things that we saw coming through. Other areas of interest was agility, and not necessarily about innovating, but more around speeding up things. But as you drive that sort of change, do it in a way that's human and cognizant of the people that you're trying to bring with you. So that's just a top line things that were coming through.
Great, thank you. And Paul, what are your thoughts on this?
I think it's possibly a sign of the times that if we'd been having this webinar a week ago, what I would say would have been very different. I just think, obviously, in terms of next year, the vaccine announcements, in the plural, as we have them now, are real game changers. And I know there's lots of kind of potential slip-ups in terms of the logistics of delivering a vaccine, but actually it is just sort of tremendously good news. And I think in terms of next year, a real game changer. And that's not sort of just idle speculation. In fact, the extent to which we have data already suggests that's true. I mean, literally an hour ago, the chief exec of EasyJet was on the Today programme announcing some pretty awful results for 2020, but saying that since the Pfizer announcement, their bookings are up by 50%. And I think that allied to the fact, in any case, when the first lockdown ended, we were seeing a V-shaped recovery in terms of the economy, rather than the U-shaped, or even worse, the L-shaped that people were speculating about. So the economy shrunk by 20+% during the first lockdown. but there was a 15% recovery well underway before we went into the second lockdown. Now, clearly there was potential for that to do a lot of damage, but I think with the vaccine announcements coming in, that could be a real game changer. We've seen that the markets have responded. EasyJet data suggests the consumers are responding. And actually there was an interesting announcement post Pfizer by Whitbread last week, where that, yes, they did make some redundancies, but actually made fewer redundancies than was forecast, because clearly they see that the end is potentially in sight. So bizarrely, again, I don't underestimate the difficulties, but you could actually see next year being quite a celebratory one, potentially. You could imagine family reunions taking place, long-awaited family reunions. I've got members of my family I've not met yet, new arrivals in my family, for example, lots of people in that boat. We've got an Olympics to look forward to. We've got the Euros to look forward to, possibly less so after England's performance against Belgium. But who knows, it could be quite a celebratory mood. If you think you're catching me in an unusually positive mood, if we were going to talk about 2022, I might be less positive, because actually that's when we start debating who's going to pick up the bill for the COVID measures. But 2021 could be great.
Maybe we need to see if there's time to do a bit on 2022 at the end then. Simon, how about you? What are your thoughts on the overarching topic today?
I'm going to pick up a little bit on Adrian's kind of train of thought here, and I'm going to mention things like emotional responsibility and emotional relevance. I think a lot of brands, they've either opened or actually been forced to kind of deal with much more emotional communications now with both employees and customers, and are realizing that, the pragmatics of their services and products and their organization and the values are wobbling a little bit, and these look good on paper, but actually these are not actually really driving the kind of relationships with either their employees or their customers, and they're much more at an emotional level. So I think in terms of that kind of employee customer space, we've got to think about how do we kind of narrow that gap between what we stand for as an organization in an emotional level and what is relevant in that message to an internal and external audience. And there's some really interesting research that's just literally came out last week. This was with the customers in the financial kind of sector, and it basically worked out from very advanced statistics that those brands that actually had a more emotional positioning had 9 times the basket share than the other brands that just mentioned price, service, quality, these very pragmatic things. So I think now that box is open and we're thinking about that kind of emotional kind of, I suppose, identity, we need to kind of get to grips with that and go forward with it, because I'm quite pleased that that is out of the box now and that we're not hiding behind numbers, because numbers don't excite anybody. And I don't really know why kind of lots of brands try to sort of, look into my eyes, look at these numbers, because that certainly does anything for me. And as a psychologist, I know that is not the way the brain likes to deal with things. It's much more about an emotional story. So that's where I'm quite excited that with the fact that we kind of got that opportunity now. I'm a little bit worried that brands, when now the vaccine, Paul mentioned the vaccine, that they just go back to what they did before, which will be awful for them. And I think you'll see more pain for those kind of brands that do that. There's an opportunity to grip, and I think they should probably grab it with both hands if they can.
Yeah, great, thank you. And William, would you mind doing a little bit on this, but also jump us into your thoughts on what it means for 2021? Because I know you've got some things that you're really already looking at for next year, so it would be great to hear about those too.
Yeah, I think, I don't like to have to be negative. Paul's been so positive. It's lovely to have positives this first thing in the morning, but I think my heart sank a little bit. I was very excited about the, what was happening with Pfizer and so on. But then I heard the guy say, oh yes, it's fantastic. We're going to be back to normal by next winter. I'm like, God, not next winter, we're going to be back to normal. So that's almost, that's over a year now we're going to have not normal. But anyway, I think, I feel that people are going to be, yes, there may be a few reunions. We may be able to get things a little bit better. But I do feel this is one of those times, normally, right, I'd say, look at it from the customer's point of view. Don't think about how you feel as a person, as a brand, as a marketer, whoever you are. Think of it from the customer's point of view. What are they going through? This is one of the very few times I'll ever say, actually, no. Think of it from your point of view, because we can be a focus group of one right now, because actually this is one of the few times that we are our customers. We are all sharing similar experiences, I'd say. So, how do I feel? I feel fed up, bit frustrated, distrustful, bit scared, bit angry, though I'm not quite sure who I should be angry with, but I'm a bit angry with somebody. And I think this is how a lot of customers are feeling and are likely to be feeling for at least the next 6 months, probably at least the next year. So I think we will see accelerated feelings of distrust, fear, frustration, and uncertainty. I think that's still the key. Yes, we've got a vaccine, but what does that mean? How will that affect things? We're also coming into Brexit issues. So I think there is this certainly very uncertain feeling amongst customers, and that'll be true, as I say, definitely going into next year. So what does that mean? Well, again, thinking of it from our point of view, from our customers' point of view, from a personal point of view, what do you do when your life's out of control, when you're not certain, when you're not sure whether you're going to keep your job tomorrow? And I think what you do is you look for ways to take back a bit of control. If things are out of control, what can I control? So anything I can do to control things a little bit. Making sure that if something else happens that I wasn't prepared for before, I'm better prepared for it now. So making sure you're ready and you are prepared. And actually, I think Simon's absolutely right, Simon and Adrian. I think this idea of the emotional, I think we are emotional. A lot of those things I talked about, fed up, frustrated, etc. We're emotional as people and as customers. And I think we are starting to reassess a little bit. And I don't want to go down that kind of Davos, great reset note, but actually we are. It's like we're in the middle of a kind of giant global gap year. And it's a chance for us all to think a little bit about what do we want out of things. So, reassessing what's important, what matters, what do you want to do, thinking about friends and family, reassessing career paths, and finding ways to relax a little bit as well in the midst of all of this, right? So what does that mean for brands if people are going through all of this? I think what we're going to need to do is find ways to enable and empower the customer, give them more agency, more choice. If they want to feel in control, help them feel in control in some way. Give them transparent data, help them make smarter choices. So empower them, make them feel they're in control. If they are reassessing, if they are emotional, if they are thinking, then yes, focus on that touchy-feely stuff. Simon's right, don't focus on the numbers as much. Focus on how people feel about your brand. Think about service, values, purpose. Give people reassurance around safety and security. And make life a bit easier for you. I think that's really it. Just make life a bit happier, a bit simpler, extend notice periods, make life a bit easier. As I say, if people are feeling emotional, make them feel better and make them think of you as the people who help them do that.
Great, thank you. And Paul, what are your thoughts about what we should be expecting and what we might see next year? And some of this might build on William's thoughts too.
Well, building on William's thoughts, I think what's really important is to think in terms of segments and understand your segment and your consumer group, because what is really clear already is that the experience of the last year and carrying that through into next year will be very different for different groups. And in all our data, we're seeing, this may be a slightly distasteful thing to say, but some people have actually had a good year. They've enjoyed working from home. They've actually been able to save. We know that because you're not going out, because you're not spending money on your commute and your lunch at work, that there's a group of people who are saving money and quite enjoying their new lifestyle. And clearly, and there's a spectrum here. At the other end of the spectrum, there are people who suffered very, very badly, lost their jobs, and there will be more job losses to come. But again, reflecting back on the impact of the vaccine, there will be fewer job losses than there would have been. Even if the vaccine is implemented slowly, the prospect of it coming is already shaping corporate behavior and markets, and that will feed through into consumer behavior. So I think the key thing is to understand your segments and maybe have different strategies, and certainly have different strategies for different segments. And and that may be challenging, because that might mean you need to, the ideal message for one segment may not be the ideal message for another segment. As I say, I do think there will be a group of consumers next year who are in a massive celebratory mode, with the prospect of normality taking place, and there will be others who will be, who clearly will be struggling. And you need to understand where which composition of your audience in terms of those differential impacts.
Great, thank you. Adrian, do you have any thoughts? Celebratory employees, perhaps, or what do you think people are going to be doing and thinking next year?
Well, I think it's an interesting one. Celebratory, maybe. I think when people talk about what's happened, people talk about, there's a big storm, right, which presents sort of COVID, etc. But people are in different sized boats. And I think people in different sized boats will reflect where you sit from sort of happiness or the opposite. I think what's important for organizations, I think all colleagues have been through the biggest change and challenge they've ever experienced. And I think that is changing the way people are now working from home. It's now changing leaderships into relationships with employees. Employees want different things from their bosses. I think all these things at play will absolutely have an impact on the service that they're delivering for consumers, particularly in service-based businesses. So for all the work that we did in the old days when I was at Barclays, building a brand's reputation, we're always conscious that actually it's the 20,000 people and 2,000 people in the branches that are delivering that customer experience every day. If those people are not aligned around the vision and the values of that organization, then that starts to manifest itself in poor customer experience. So I think given what's gone on, it's really important for leadership to lean in and listen to employees and understand what their drivers are. And I think some of the things to sort of stay afloat is to lean into some of those things that are having a negative impact on the culture, and trying to change those. Things like longer hours, trying to do more for less, hierarchy, poor planning, all of these things are the need to be agile. All these things are impacting businesses' ability to be able to stay relevant with their consumers. And you need to be able to unpick all of that so that your brand is still fit for purpose, because on the consumer side, people are wanting something else. So for me, there's a massive opportunity to really ensure there's real alignment in values, deep alignment in values. And a lot of the work we do is in that space, around understanding that vernacular intuitively so that you can build meaningful relationships with consumers. And I think that is going to be fundamentally crucial in 21 more than it ever was. That connectivity between your employees, what drives them, and harnessing that so they can deliver great customer experiences is key.
Thank you, Simon. I know you'll have something to add on this one.
Well, I was just listening to Paul and Adrian, and I'm thinking, actually, yeah, that's exactly that segmentation of your employees and your audience. And what typically brands do is they segment on what people do, which, or a label, how old they are, what gender they are, millennials, X-gen, whatever it might be. And these are really artificial labels, and they can give you into a lot of trouble if you use these and try and drive your planning against these, because these are literally just names. They don't tell you why people do stuff, and to Adrian's point, they don't tell you the needs and the motivations of people. So you need to do a little bit more homework here. And the nice news is that it's quite easy to do. You can segment up people by their needs. Do I need control? Do I need ego? What is it I need? And you can do it for an audience internally and externally. If you know that, then how you align their values with your organizational values, but you also know how to communicate with them. And that's kind of, some of the actual forward-thinking brands have been doing this and having some remarkable effects in terms of their onboarding and their market growth with their customers, for example, because they're not giving them numbers and they're not putting them into these artificial camps of, these are millennials. Well, I hate to break the news, but millennials are no different in their needs than people in their 80s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Psychologically, we're all the same. But what we need to do, to Adrian and Paul's point, is segment up people and understand them on that more kind of emotional need point of view. Now, I wanted to, on the basis of this, if I wanted to flip it around and look internally, I wanted to ask actually the other panelists, one of the things I think is going to be really interesting in the year ahead is how do we manage, so if we're an organization, how do we manage this oscillation between working a bit in the office with working a bit at home? Because I think that's going to happen next, isn't it? At the moment, we're all at home, generally speaking. How are we going to cope with, actually, who do I need to be when I'm in the office, as opposed to who do I need to be when I'm home? And that requires, I think, slightly different ways of thinking about stuff. And Adrian's opinion would be really interesting here, how he thinks people are, or have organizations thought about this? Because I don't know about you guys, but I am certainly a different person when I'm at home than I am when I'm in an office. And to Adrian's point, if I'm now dealing with customers in those two spaces, depending on who you're going to get, isn't that going to kind of give you a different customer experience with me?
I think I've been debating this myself. So normally, from me, you get the Queen's English and you get me dialing up my tone of voice to its maximum. What I found in the freedom of my own home, I've become more and more and more and more authentic every day in terms of, and it slips out in some of my delivery. And actually, I've quite enjoyed that because it's allowed kind of my superpowers to generally come to the fore. Because I used to spend a lot of time trying to be other people and sometimes not getting my points across. So actually, I would say, from a organizational point of view, if people are at home and are actually being able to be more authentic around who they are, then guess what? They should be able to deliver better customer interactions. So I think it should be encouraged in many ways. I think what it also does, the point that you're making, it really does make the point that you need to have really clear articulated values so people know the boundaries around how you communicate. So we don't want people to be robots, but they need to know the spaces with which they can allow their sort of colorful personalities to come through. And I think the final bit around, and I think we're seeing it in the stuff that we're doing, is a constant listening function now that needs to happen in organizations where employees are concerned. Because what's happening around us in the world means that it's impacting the culture constantly. And there's a way to sort of listen on an ongoing basis to manage how people are feeling and thinking, because that's going to then impact their interactions with consumers. But it's a really good point.
Adrian, sorry, just to kind of pick up on this, how do you think then, given the fact that we can be a little bit ourselves at home, how's that going to land when we have to go back into the office a little bit? Because I can see that that's going to be a bit of an issue. Yeah, we now go back into our kind of labelled box at work, huh?
Well, I think in many ways, we've opened Pandora's box where that's concerned. I'm seeing, when you look at so we do a lot of work in values research, right? And prior to COVID, I guess, there's been a world of that go, fight, win, champion type culture. I think people have now leaned in more into community, more thinking about others, more empathy. And I think that's going to allow for greater bridges between what can happen between leadership, middle office, and the front office. I've now been in calls and I've seen your living room, so that allows me to have a different conversation with you than one I would have had prior. And I'm hoping that will start to manifest itself, particularly as we fleet in between work. I think it's going to be around for quite some time.
Well, I think that sense of authenticity and that sense of community that Adrian's talking about, I think it's very true within the office. I think it's also very true and will be very true next year going forward in terms of marketing and communications activity. I think actually, if you're thinking about how to deal with what's going on a very practical level, I think that whole idea of being authentic and thinking about your customers as a community and you being human with them, I think is absolutely essential. And I think we've seen all of these communications messages around kind of they've just been a bit top down and saying we can help, but not really doing it sideways. They've not been authentic. They've felt a bit tick box. And I think it's going to be essential to be a friend. There's the famous story about the guy who falls down the hole, the guy who's walking along the street and he falls down the hole. And he can't get out. The sides are too steep. He can't get out. And he sees a doctor walking along, and the doctor says to the doctor, "Doctor, help me out." And the doctor writes him a prescription, and he drops it down the hole, and that doesn't help. And then he sees a priest walking around. And he says, "Priest, well, Father," he says, "help me out. I'm stuck in a hole." And the priest writes him a prayer, and he throws it down. And so, this guy's stuck down the hole, and he sees his friend Jim walking past. He says, "Jim, help me out." And his friend Jim jumps in the hole, and he goes, "Jim, you idiot. Now we're both stuck here." And his friend says, "Yes, but I've been here before, and I can help you out. I know the way out." And that's what we need, is we need brands to actually be that friend. We need brands to jump in the hole with us. We need brands to actually be genuinely sympathetic, to see their customers as actually people who they can help and who can help them. So I think that's going to be key in any marketing communications. Authenticity. Imagine people are your friend. Imagine that if that customer's your friend, how would you relate to them in the midst of this crisis? You'd be sympathetic. You might, if appropriate, offer a little bit of advice, but that's going to be key. Support, I think, and being friendly.
Yeah, you've kind of taken us down the path we were aiming to go this morning, which is to really have a look at sort of the practical impacts of what's been happening and what we think next year is going to look like. And obviously a lot of our audience this morning are working in marketing and communications functions within organizations, and when they're thinking about their planning, what should they be thinking about, and how can we take quite a lot of this conversation and these learnings from this morning into sort of how we think about planning for next year, and what these brands should actually deliver. Paul, I wondered if you mind kicking us off and just sharing your perspective on the slightly more practical side of this.
I think so much of what I've got to say this morning is coloured by the vaccine, and I apologise for that. But that train of thought would lead me to think of next year in phases, and quite distinct phases. That there's, for the first quarter, we're going to be in something like the sort of circumstances we're in now, social distancing being a feature. There's no way the vaccine can be rolled out in a major way before spring, so we've got a winter to get through, which is going to feel much like the last 6 months, on a kind of knife edge, monitoring R rates, all that sort of stuff. People going around wearing masks, and it feeling like a very strange world. So you've got Q1 looking like that. You've got Q2 potentially looking, just the weather itself might improve things, people being more out and about, more optimistic, and then the vaccine kicking in, and hopefully in a significant way in advance of next autumn, next winter. So I think in terms of planning for the year, I plan for a year that is the first quarter that's like what we've had in the last 6 months, but something very different. So what might you do in those different phases? One thing that struck me is that in the current phase, as marketers and communicators, you've got something of a captive audience, that actually people are at home. People have a very restricted list of things that they can do. They can't go to the pub, they can't go on holiday. And so I think a number of brands are doing quite interesting things with that captive audience. I was struck by, for example, the Audi Presents campaign, so not a financial services one, but that is basically trying to help their customers through the potential boredom of the current circumstances by putting on events for them, and to a range of them. There's an audience with Jose Mourinho, there's celebrity chefs doing their stuff, there are opera singers doing their stuff. What a great service by Audi to entertain. Now that may be less practical as consumers get out and about come spring, and you may need to revert to something that would have been more typical in the pre-COVID period. But I think seeing seeing the year in those kind of phases and planning for the year in those sort of phases, and making the most of this initial period when you pretty much do have a captive audience.
Thank you. Adrian, what are your thoughts on the more practical side of next year?
Well, when I think about how we build brands, typically, we'd start by saying, well, we need to find something that's an idea that's different from our competitors and increasingly relevant for our consumers, right? And if you can start to build up in that space, you can find some white space to start to land your brand. And that's typically the sort of starting point for planning, right? A really strong and differentiated brand. I think the difference in 2021, more than ever, particularly for financial services brands, is you also need to understand, you're probably going to hear what I'm going to say, employees. You need to understand what your aspirations and motivations of your employees are in a real and deep and meaningful way, particularly for service-based brands, particularly if they're on the front line executing, shall we say, services for customers. You need to understand what their personal motivations are, what their aspirations are. You also need to understand their views on the workplace culture. So what is it they currently see, or what are they currently experiencing in their places of work, particularly the closer they are to consumer interactions. And you need to understand what they desire. What will they like from their places of work in terms of the culture that they're going to lean into and drive their drive benefits or drive their discretionary effort, for want of better words. And I think organizations will do well to really understand that in a very detailed way. I mean, a lot of the work that we do these days in decoding culture is literally an 8-minute assessment, which we can go back to boards and show them what their culture's doing. And we sort of break it down at the sort of, we call it the government and constituent level, where you can look for an entire organization. And I think understanding that data is important to feed in to the overarching piece around how you build reputations. Otherwise, the opposite will happen. You can look at trends, you can align your brands to those trends to give you cut through. And then when customers cross the threshold, it's not delivered in the experience that's delivered by employees, and it all falls over into poor customer experience. So the practical thing next year is not to, or to avoid the employee voice at your peril, and to look at shiny objects from a trends point of view and not have good, meaning and sustainable ways to engage those guys, because ultimately those guys will become your brand in the eyes of your consumers.
Simon, what are your thoughts to add on to this?
Yeah, I would echo the other panelists, really. It's that emotional pull, isn't it? It's, moving away from these very artificial labels of what we think drives customers, and they're mostly what you visibly can see, sort of these age, kind of gender groups, whatever it might be, kind of, your financial kind of status. It's getting much more to, I would agree with age, the whys, what drives you. And if you can do that both internally and externally, because that's much more emotionally relevant than a number, which means nothing. It's kind of why would I engage with that number? You're not giving me the emotional reason. So brands that will actually start practically investing in understanding their internal and external audiences on that emotional segmentation, I think is a really worthwhile. And brands are doing it now. We've been helping them, and they're having really, really interesting, we're looking at things like 50% increase in sales. And we haven't changed anything to do with price. It is literally, we're using more emotional based messages because we know what is driving the customers. We know what they need to hear. And I think now, and again, both to kind of Adrian and Will's point, because we've opened that box, the last 6 months has been very emotional for a lot of customers and a lot of employees. And so they're much more in touch with that. They understand, they're judging kind of organizations on that emotional level. And so when we go back to normality, and when some organizations put that emotion back in the box again, you're really going to annoy some of your employees and your customers, because they're going to be like, no. I know what it's like now to kind of be emotional. You can't just kind of put it back to what it was normally now. That beast is out. You now have to deal with it. And that's partly why I asked that question around, it's a very finite kind of area, but for me, I'm quite fascinated to sort of see how are employees going to deal with being a little bit in the office and a little bit at home, because they're completely different worlds, and have their host organisations thought about how they're going to help them through that transition? I bet they haven't.
I do think it'll be interesting from a personal perspective. Obviously, just what you're going to wear every day. You can't put the tracksuit bottoms on with a smart top. You know, there are these important issues that we're all going to have to get around, leading sort of slightly more split lives at home and at work. William, before we move on, is there anything else that you wanted to add onto this what it means in practice section?
No, I mean,
you're good.
I think. Oh no.
Oh no, go on.
No, I agree.
Okay, so what I'd like us to do now is just to spend a little bit of time talking about the opportunities and challenges for next year. And we will then move on to take some questions from the audience. So please do submit any questions you'd like to ask through the chat function now, and we'll come on to those very, very quickly. Paul, what's your perspective on the main sort of opportunities and challenges for brands and marketers next year?
The challenge is getting this stuff right in such a volatile environment where the mood could be up and down, and just having your sort of antenna so sort of finely tuned that you're picking up the right signals from your audiences. And the potential for, for all my unusually sort of positive remarks earlier on, the potential that the vaccines don't work, they can't, the refrigeration is a disaster, or whatever. We can't. The challenge, you are clearly, this is not rocket science, you are clearly operating in a very volatile environment where the mood, and I can echo what the other guy said, it's been a very emotional time, and where therefore the emotions could flip very, very quickly, and the mood of the audience could flip very quickly. So I think that's the challenge. The opportunity is the flip side of that. Actually, those who are sensitive, those who get it right, will be rewarded. If you are in tune, and particular at times like these, people will remember, and that's the stuff that loyalty is made of.
Thank you. And William, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think spot on, Paul. I think people will remember. I think we've all been like little mini Santa Clauses running around checking out who's been naughty and who's been nice. We will definitely remember, what did this brand do in the great COVID towards Daddy. So yes, that's vital. And I think it's essential that we have to understand what people are going through. As you said, I think that's the point, that the challenge and the opportunity are the same. It depends how you grasp them. It's because the challenge and the opportunity are the fact that people are feeling emotional, and it's volatile, and they don't know what's going to happen. Which means that if you do it wrong, they're going to remember. But if you do it right, if you actually find a way to be authentic with them, to understand what their needs are. That's what one of the things the authenticity is about, is being able to understand what it is that they're going through, and try and, as I say, be a friend if you can. It might seem glib, but actually, I think I might have mentioned this at our last panel, actually, but the TGI Fridays, famously, one of the first things that anybody who's a waiter at TGI Fridays knows is the first thing you do when you go to a table, you have to get down, you have to squat down so that you are on the same level as everybody. So your face is on the same level as everybody else's face. And that's what brands are going to have to do. They are going to have to be at the same level as people. People are feeling emotional. They're going to notice whether you were human or not, whether your staff were human, your employees were human, all of those touch points. And as I say, if you can, but by doing that, you can understand, if you're looking into somebody's eyes, you can understand actually what it is that they need. And I think we're going to see, all the needs that I've talked about, the fact that people are feeling insecure, they're going to look for safety, they're going to need serenity, they're going to need a feeling of solidarity. So if you can pick up on those needs and actually deliver those needs to people, that is a huge opportunity, and people will remember.
Great, it's going to be lots of memories. Sort of a big trend coming up here, the elephant that never forgets. Adrian, what's your thoughts on this?
I think we've covered a lot of it. I would just say
Yeah.
the opportunity is understanding the fact that, or accepting the fact that, and I do a lot of work in the inclusion space, and I say the same thing. There's one overarching thing is we are all human, and the fact that we're all human means that we all share values, right? And those values manifest in the way we communicate and the way that we behave. And they transcend gender, they transcend race, they transcend age, and they transcend all the other areas we've talked about when we do traditional segmentation. So the opportunity for organizations is to really understand the circular value system that we've researched that sits in all of us, and really use that to see what you can do to drive alignment between internal and external audiences in order to meet customer changing expectations.
Right, and Simon, before we go to questions, any opportunities and challenges from you?
I think an opportunity would be, this is going to be interesting, is for brands to rethink how they deal with their employees and customers. And what I mean by that is, if you can think, how are you helping your employee or customer avoid who they don't want to be like? Because that's what, as humans, Adrian's just mentioned it, we spend half the time trying to be someone that we don't like. How can we avoid that person? And then if a brand can also then be a bit more positive and say, how can I help you be more like who you want to be? And they spend some money on researching that stuff, I think it's been shown to be very effective in kind of creating some very positive relationships with employees and their customers. And I think very quickly, the challenge for me is that given most humans are lazy, that I'm really quite worried that a lot of brands would just go back to what was before, which would be awful, because a lot of brands were pretty awful before. So, you know, I think to Adrian's point, it's, you know, the Pandora's box open now. I think that the forward-thinking brands are going to take that opportunity and go forward with it. The others are going to be like, when can I put that lid back on the box again? And to their own detriment, I think.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple of questions in from the people that have joined this morning, so I just want to go to these for a few minutes. So the first one is really focused on sort of authenticity and around employees, and how sort of the wearing of the different hats, the home and the office, as we hopefully move back more into being able to be in offices, you know, how could this impact internal communications and strategies? Do we think organisations will be investing internally? And how has the feeling of being valued by your employer evolved this year? Adrian, I feel like I need to come to you first on this one, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's quite interesting. So I think you could hear by the way I've kind of spoken today is, you know, I spent many years building brands, but I kind of came to a point, however good you are at building brands, if you can't align the people around it, it's almost a false economy, because you deliver a great idea, great media, customers cross the threshold, and then the experience with the employee is not great, and it kills the brands on social media and NPS. So we spent a lot of time thinking, how do you really engage people? My feeling is that you can only do that if you can really understand their values, which I've talked about. And my view is, if you can drill into that, then you're well on the way to building a brand that is generally manifested by the people delivering the experience, and is therefore manifesting in the consumer outcome. So that's kind of my sort of quick answer to your question.
Great. Does anybody want to add anything on this one? If not, we can move on to the next question.
It's that segmentation by values, isn't it, and needs. And right. The trouble is that if you just use a questionnaire for that, people will give you, they'll project who they want to be. They won't tell you who they really are. So you're going to need some really interesting kind of methods to kind of bubble out what really drives that person from an honest point. Because if you want an honest conversation and build an honest relationship with them, you don't want to build it on what they project they're like and what they project they need from you, because we all are pretty bad at doing that as humans.
Yeah. Can I say that that's exactly kind of what our business does. We have a bespoke way of doing that, which, you know, we can all go to the pub and I can share that with you another time. But it's to your point. And actually what we've seen, to that bit around authenticity, we've seen a phenomenal growth in our business. So we're experiencing a trend where employee or brands are understanding the importance of listening to their employees in order to drive authenticity. And we've seen that in phenomenal growth. So for me, it's already happening.
I think that's the point. I think that authenticity, I think if people are emotional, they're going to be judging brands much more emotionally. And we've seen that already happening. We're already seeing the way that people are looking at brands is more emotional. And Simon and Adrian and Paul are right to talk about emotions. And I think because of that, I think people are therefore going to be judging brands on how those frontline staff are and the relationship they have with the individuals within those brands. So I think actually that sense of service, those touch points, those frontline staff are going to be much more important. And as Adrian says, they've got to ensure that the values of the brand are coming out through those frontline staff, the customers are meeting, but also that those frontline staff are authentic and empathetic. They are human, and they need to, because they're ultimately really selling the brand right now, that emotional feeling about the people and the staff you meet.
Okay, we've had a couple of other great questions in, so I just want to try and get through a couple more. So one, here's a slightly more fundamental question, which is, will we see a return to the old normal in 2021, 2022, or whether, the phrase new normal is being used a lot. Will there actually be a new normal, or are sort of the behaviours and the societal values we had before so ingrained that we will just do everything we can to try and go back to them? Simon, what are your thoughts on that one?
No.
No.
I'll elaborate very quickly. No, because you'll have a power struggle now. You'll have those brands who don't feel confident in their own identity trying to force people back to what they had and in control before. You'll have some brands now who will be forward thinking and think, actually, we do need to create new relationships. You've had employees have had a different taste of things. They won't want to go back to necessarily what was normal. They might want to do it in a different way. And even if they're in the office, I think they've had a door open that they never knew was there before. So for them to go back to normal, I think that's going to also be a struggle. And customers, definitely not. I mean, they're going to want things done in a different way as well. They're going to want some normality, but again, they've experienced things in a different way. And I think once you open those doors, it's very difficult to close them down again. I think we might actually experience them in different ways, but we have to factor them in 2021, I think.
Okay, so Simon votes for there will actually be a new normal. Adrian, what do you think?
I tend to agree. I don't know if the term's new normal, but what I can tell you, when you look at COVID-19, you look at the things around George Floyd, people's personal values have changed. So people typically were getting the train every day into the city and driven by extrinsic values around things they can show. A lot of people now been at home, spending more time with their families, building relationships with their gardens and their neighbours and their local shops. And actually, that's changed their perspective of the world. They've realised actually it's not necessarily all about go, fight, win and hunt. Actually, there's power in giving and serving others. And I think that has absolutely changed. So I think when things do start to, as time goes on, people are not going to want to revert back to can I get more and more and more widgets? I think their minds are open to the wider things that drive success as individuals, and these people are sitting on boards and running companies, and that's why there's going to be a fundamental difference, and we will never revert to what was happening prior.
It's another vote for new normal. Paul, what about you?
I think there's a third way here. I think there will be a new normal that retains some elements of the old normal.
I'll go with that.
And the bits of the old normal are that people still want to go to the pub, they still want to go on holiday. Some of those things that have been denied them this year, they will return to and will embrace enthusiastically again, or is that just me? I think they will. Some things we will come out of this experience changed, and the way we work is one of those things, and the split between office and home and all those things are true. The other thing that will be part of the new normal, which I kind of referenced at the very beginning, come 2022, I don't think it'll be 2021, but come 2022, there's a bill to pay here. We spent a lot of money and we've lost a lot of money. And there will be a debate about who pays for that. Is it increased taxes? Is it reduced? public services, which I think will be quite hard given the performance of the NHS and public services and care and so on. So is it going to be rich people who pay taxes, poor people who pay those increased taxes? Is it going to be businesses? Is it going to be individuals? I think we're in for, come 2022, it's got all the hallmarks of a new set of culture wars about who actually foots the bill for this.
Great. And William, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree with that, Paul. I think it's going to be a new abnormal because I don't think people are going to necessarily see it as a normal. I think actually, if you look at what's happened with any of the other crises in recent years, whether it's been, the crunch in 2008 or 9/11, 7/7 periods, the impact those had, what we see is this kind of a big explosion. There's a big burst of new feelings, and then it kind of does fall back a little bit. But if you look at what happened around 2008, we have a much savvier customer than we had before then. So yes, it's not all about cheapness, but they're savvier. So I think we will definitely see this sense of this will have an impact. But I think where this is different is people are going to be feeling their way towards something. So it's not going to be normal. It's not going to feel normal. It's going to be this kind of slightly abnormal, and everyone's going to be trying to feel their way towards what their own normal is going to eventually be.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to wrap things up there so that anybody who's got a 9:30 meeting has a few minutes in between. But panelists, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your thoughts with everybody. And to those that joined, I hope you found it useful and took something away from it that will support you with your planning next year. We will be sharing write-ups and the recording on LinkedIn, so you can come back to it if there's anything you want to hear again. But thank you so much, and I hope you all have great days. Thank you. Bye-bye.